title for chapter 2 is The Duel for North America, because that's exactly what it was. It's going to be a duel for North America. We're going to be discussing the French and Indian War. And whenever we talk about the French and Indian War, understand this, that we're talking about the French and the Huron Indians and the English and the Iroquois and the colonists. So once again, on the one side, you have the French and the Huron Indians, and on the other side, you have the English, the Iroquois, and the colonists together. So hopefully that makes sense. But let's get into and talk about French colonization, because it's completely different from English colonization. We know, and we've talked about in detail, the Spanish coming over, 100 years of domination after Columbus, from say 1500 all the way to 1588, when the Spanish Armada was defeated. That opened the door for English exploration. But about the same time that the English started exploring, the French did also. As a matter of fact, they started the first settlement at Quebec in 1608. That's 1 year after Jamestown. And it was that area was settled up in Canada by Samuel de Champlain, who was acting on a claim of land by Jacques Cartier all the way back in the early 1500s, if you remember from chapter 1. And then the French didn't do anything about that claim, and it wasn't until 1608 when Samuel de Champlain went over and started bringing people over there so they could trade with the local Indians. Louis XIV took a big time interest in overseas colonies, much like Queen Elizabeth did. And one thing that they wanted to do was befriend the local Indians. That's another big difference between the English colonists and the French colonists. The English colonists were oftentimes at odds with the Native Americans, where the French came over and actually got along well with them because they wanted to trade furs for whatever the Indians wanted. A lot of times it was just trinkets and blankets and guns and things like that. And there was a lucrative trade that went on between the Huron Indians and the French. Beaver felts, other animal furs were in high demand in Europe, and the French knew it, and they could make a ton of money off these Native Americans, but they had to get along with them, and they did. It's going to have a profound impact on what's going to happen in the French and Indian War, and we'll talk about that as we go. Another difference between the French colonies and the English colonies is the French had total control over the colonies. The king was 100% in charge. And we know that the English colonies, not so. Right? You had proprietors, you had royal governors, you had control by the colonies, like, say, Rhode Island and Roger Williams. So, the English were really lax on who was in control, and salutary neglect was happening there. They were neglecting the colonies, whereas France wouldn't. The French king was in charge, and he ruled with an iron fist. The population of New France was small compared to the English. The English, their philosophy was, if you don't want to be Anglican, don't let the door hit you in the behind. Right? They said, go to the New World, go wherever you want, just get out of our hair. On the flip side, the French, their philosophy was, if you weren't Catholic, which was their religion in France, if you weren't Catholic, it was punishable by death. So they didn't allow their dissenters to go to America. So who went to America? People who were searching for, something, obviously money, people who were involved in the trade industry. So the numbers were small. And it says there too that the landowning French peasants had little economic motive to move. It wasn't like in England, where if you were born poor, you were going to die poor. There was more opportunity in France, so less people came. So they also came over and tried to Catholicize the Native Americans. So French missionaries came over as well. That was another big reason. So in 1645, you could see how vast the French territory is compared to the English colonies in 1645. You see all that blue area, and it's going to expand and it's going to contract at times too. The voyage of Robert de La Salle, who was a French Jesuit, and an explorer. De La Salle High School in Concord, named after this guy here. He traveled all the way down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, from Quebec all the way down to New Orleans. His main purpose for traveling down that river was not to see the Mississippi River. He believed at some point it was going to turn west, and he wanted to find the Pacific Ocean to get to Asia. So, you know, still, even in the 1600s, they're looking for a way to get to the passage through the continent. They still haven't figured that out yet. But his journey, the significance of Robert de La Salle's journey, is that he laid claim to land for France, a vast territory of land for France. They had now two strong capitals in French America. One was at Quebec in the north, and the other one was at New Orleans in the south. Because if you travel all the way down the Mississippi River, you eventually get to New Orleans. So now this map right here shows you New France, you know, about 55 years after the previous map that I showed you. So the territory now that is in green has expanded all the way to the Rocky Mountains. The French territory is massive. However, the amount of people that are there, very, very small compared to the amount of English settlers that have jammed into the yellow area in this map. So yeah, as you can see here, you look up in the north, up the top, you see Quebec, and you look all the way down the south, you see New Orleans. And the Mississippi River goes all the way in this territory here. So he went he left Quebec, went down this area, got to the Ohio River, eventually got to the Mississippi River, and then down to New Orleans, laid claim to land for France, all that land seen right there in green. Now, one thing you also may notice about this map is that the French territory butts up against the English territory all along this line here near the Appalachian Mountains. And this is going to be the disputed area. This is going to be where the English and the French are going to have issues. Now, the English had no idea that the French didn't have very many people out there. They didn't have drones. They didn't have census that they could find out how many people are out there. In the mind of the English settlers over here, the French were the boogeyman. They were like, you know, because they've been told since birth, they were the enemy, and they were brutal. And the wars that have existed between these two countries for many, many years is going to affect the colonists located on the East Coast. They're going to fear the French, even though, again, I repeat that they weren't much of a force. The French weren't, because of their numbers being so small. But also I emphasize that the English had no idea about that. They believed that the French are their number one threat. And they thought that the potential for the French, this is what in their mind, they thought that the French were going to travel down these rivers and be able to go from this area and take over the entire eastern seaboard. We know that that would be next to impossible, but if you were living in the 1700s, you believe that's possible. You believe that they can go down the Ohio River, up the Ohio River, use the Ohio River, this area, and then some of these rivers go directly into Virginia, and they could take over that territory potentially. So you know you got some major issues there. So a lot of battles in this talks about the battles between England and France that are literally happen all over the world, and a massacre that occurred in Deerfield in Massachusetts, in the western part of Massachusetts, between Native American Hurons and the English settlers. And of course, the French are allied with the Huron Indians. So now you're talking about they're definitely enemies. And you can see here by the maps that I show you that at times you're having different wars that occur where land is changing hands. The disputed area right here in pink, that's the area where many of these battles are going to occur. You know, the Spanish are going to get involved. An English captain by the name of Captain Jenkins had one of his ears sliced off by a sword of a Spanish revenue authority. And then the ear was taken back to the king as a warning. So, you know, war broke out in 1793 between England and Spain. So it's not like, you know, it's just France and England being involved. Spain is also getting involved. Native Americans are getting involved. We are talking about a world war here. It's literally a world war that is occurring here. So there's what it looked like in 1745. You could see how vast that French territory is. Just another look at that. So here's George Washington's introduction into our history class. And George Washington at this time is young. He's 21 years old. He lives in Virginia. He is actually a land surveyor. And he is hired by the governor of Virginia to go out and survey the land in preparation for building a fort in the disputed territory. That area along what's called the Ohio River Valley area, the area that England feared France would use to take over the entire East Coast. So the English, the colonists wanted, and directed by the king also from England, they wanted him to build a fort out there to protect the English colonies from the French. Well, George Washington was given command of some troops, about 150 Virginia militia. They traveled 290 miles from Virginia to where these forts are, which is present-day area of Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. He was supposed to go out there and go see if he could scout out. Now, you're not going to take 150 soldiers and just blindly go and move out west. You're going to have scouts that are going to go out first, and they're going to go a little bit ahead, and they're going to come back and report, hey, we're good, let's go forward. They're going to go back and forth. And that's what was happening. Well, as they got closer to the area where they want to build the fort, one of the scouts came back to George Washington and said, hey, stop where you are. There's actually a French fort that's built right in the area that we want our fort to be built. So Washington retreated a bit, set up a hastily built fort called Fort Necessity, and sent some scouts back to Virginia, all the way back to 290 miles to Virginia to go ask the governor what they should do. Should they hunker down? Should they fight? Should they go back to Virginia? Should they pick another spot? He wanted to know what his orders were. Long story short, that Washington and his 150 men were found by the French. A small battle ensued in which a couple of French were killed by Washington's men. The French captured George Washington and threatened to burn him at the stake. And, calmer heads prevailed. And so as not to make this into an international issue, the French released George Washington, and George Washington was free to go. This is probably the closest that George Washington has ever come to death before this. And even after that, he has some run-ins, obviously. But, I mean, history could be completely different had the French executed or burned at the stake George Washington like they threatened to do. But they let him go, and he was able to go back and tell his story to the governor, who then told his story to the king. And the governor sent word to the king back in England, what do you want us to do about this fort? And if you want us to fight and defeat this fort, then we're going to need troops. So you could see here in this map, I think you could see my cursor, Fort Necessity was right here. The French fort that was built in that area is called Fort Duquesne. It looks like Duquesne, but it's really called Fort Duquesne, and it's right here along the banks of the Ohio River. And this is exactly where the English colonists wanted to build their fort. So that's the disputed area right there that they're going to be fighting over. You can see here Fort Duquesne located here. So here's what's going to happen with this. There's going to be a battle that occurs. I'm going to go back and talk about the Albany Plan of Union in a second here. But the French and Indian War is going to begin when George Washington is going to go into the wilderness, and he is actually second in command behind a group that was sent by the British, led by a 60-year-old retread general by the name of General Braddock. And he brought with him 2,000 inexperienced British soldiers. There were 2,000 of them in bright red coats and black shiny hats and black shiny boots. They stuck out like sore thumbs. So there's 2,000 of them. In the back of the group was George Washington and his 450 Virginia militia. So you're looking at 2,450 men that were going to walk from Virginia all the way to where Pittsburgh is today. You know, they're going to walk 290 miles and take the same route that George Washington had taken a year before. But the British style of fighting was mano a mano, was don't hide behind rocks, don't camouflage yourself. You know, wars that were fought in Europe were fought on battlefields between armies that would just go at each other with and whoever was left standing at the end was the winner of that battle. So this is how the English thought the war would happen with the French, is that it was going to be out in the open. So they took their 2,450 men and they went out west, and that's not the way things are going to go. Just about, you know, as they're getting close to Fort Duquesne, the French and the Native Americans, the Hurons, were hiding behind rocks, in trenches, up in trees. They surrounded Braddock and his men. Braddock is almost immediately killed by gunfire. And, you know, a lot of his men are killed. George Washington is now in charge, and they're totally surrounded, almost surrounded by the French and the Huron, when George Washington does something that he's going to do quite a few times, and that's to hastily retreat. He demands that everybody retreats. So they flee from the battle. Washington fled from the battle. The British redcoats fled from the battle, and they ran all the way back to Virginia, being chased by the French and the Indians. They had no idea that this was the type of warfare that they were going to be faced with. The French learned from the Indians, the Huron. They taught them how to fight Indian style, and the British weren't ready for that. And they were defeated in this first battle, and it was a devastating defeat for them. But it leads to the emergence of George Washington as leader, even though he retreated. So it's going to have significance later on in history, that's for sure. So the French and Indian War has begun, and it's only a matter of time. We'll talk more about later on in this chapter about how the French, there's no way they're going to win this war. They don't have enough men. The English don't know that yet. And they lose this devastating battle in the beginning. But one of the problems, here's an artist's depiction of the Battle of Fort Duquesne right here. You could see the chaos, Native Americans hiding behind trees and rocks, and the English were totally surprised here. The last thing I want to cover here in this part one is the Albany Plan of Union. This was an idea that had been started by Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin knew that unity was going to be really, really tough. It goes all the way back to the New England Confederation, how difficult unity was going to be. There was the first seeds of colonial unity with the New England Confederation. And George Andros being sent later on, about 40 years later, was an attempt by England to try to control the colonies. But that didn't work out well. So, you know, there's some major issues when it came to unity, and there's some things that have gone on in history. You know, we talked about the Great Awakening being the first time that there was any kind of colonial unity. Here is a plan in 1754 proposed by Benjamin Franklin where the colonies and England would come together for the purpose of defense. He drew this political cartoon, one of the first major political cartoons in American history. It's a disjointed snake. And basically he's saying, if we don't come together, we're going to die. It says join or die. And if they don't find a way to come together, they're going to lose this war to the French. So the Albany Plan of Union was a two-pronged plan. One, England was to send a leader. It would be like a general / president who would be in charge of the operations, the battles. And then the colonies would have their own lawmaking body that would assist the president / general. It was like a sharing of power. Well, the English in England, they didn't like it because they didn't want to give up power to the governing body. The colonists didn't like it because they didn't want to give up power to someone sent by England. So the thing never passed. Albany Planning Union never passed. We use it as evidence that unity was a big, big issue during this time, and they needed to address that. So we'll continue on with that as we go, but that's the end of part one.